Hello and welcome to this Personnel Today webinar brought to you in association with Questback. I'm Rob Moss, editor of Personnel Today, and today we're looking at high performance cultures in organisations and how employers can try to foster them. HR can create strategic initiatives that aim to improve employee engagement or drive performance, but often it's the organisation's culture that can hold such initiatives back. So today we're going to provide 5 steps to help you understand and improve your company's culture. And to do that, we're joined by 2 experts in the field. Andrew Cox is the former head of engagement and employer brand at HSBC. Andrew is an assessment psychologist with more than 15 years experience in the field of employee engagement, culture and change. He led the European employee engagement practice at Watson Wyatt before moving to HSBC, where he was instrumental in driving the bank's move away from traditional employee surveys to an integrated platform-based approach. And Alex Vilker is HR domain expert at Questback. He has over 17 years experience in voice of the employee and voice of the customer programs, mainly with large international organizations in the communication and financial sectors. Before we begin, I'll briefly outline the format for today. In a moment, I'll hand over to Andrew and Alex for their presentation, after which we'll run a short Q&A, which will run us to a finish at around 1:45. As we go along, we're keen to receive all your questions and urge you to submit these at any time in the chat pane on the left-hand side of your screen. But unless I feel there's anything particularly pressing, we will save those up for the end. We are recording the webinar, and an on-demand version will become available in the next few days, along with the PowerPoint slides and a transcript of today's presentation and discussion. And there'll also be a white paper, which I will tell you about later. Okay, you'll find an on-demand version of the webinar at personneltoday.com/webinars. Okay, we begin by welcoming Andrew Cox. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Rob. Last night, as I was preparing my speaker notes for this session, I was listening to the news on the radio in the background, and I lost count of the number of times that culture was mentioned within the broadcast. There were stories about the City of Birmingham Children's Services, the Fire Service, Google in France, the European Assembly, and actually the news was littered from top to bottom with references to culture and organisational culture. Mostly around the negative aspects, it has to be said, because that's what's newsworthy. But obviously, this is something that would not have been the case a few years ago, as few as 2 years ago probably. So culture is very much at top of mind at the moment. It's on the top of everyone's list of priorities in terms of investigating what it is for their organisations to avoid those kinds of negative consequences. But what about the reverse? What about how we can foster a culture in a positive sense that drives optimal performance and optimal business outcomes? And that's the focus that we're looking here for this webinar. Many organisations that I talk to express a desire to achieve, in inverted commas, a high performance culture. Very often this is without any real meaningful attempt to define what it is or to measure progress towards it. Culture is arguably, however, better understood than employee engagement. There's a far greater body of historical psychological research behind it, and certainly a greater consensus about what it is and why it's important. And yes, yet while most organisations measure employee engagement and manage it, far fewer do the same for culture. I have a feeling this is going to change in the future. I see culture now as analogous to the concept of brand. 30 years ago, very little attention was paid to the concept of brand. Now it's very well understood, managed, and is at the core of organisational thinking and strategy. It's absolutely unthinkable for organisations to let things drift with regard to their brand. And in 30 years' time, I think we'll be looking back at this decade as the time when we got serious about culture. And we'll probably be fairly incredulous that it took us so long to get there. Your culture defines your organisation in as much as it's yours, it's unique. Anyone can copy your strategy, your products, your service levels, etc., but nobody can copy your culture. It attracts people to your organisation, it retains them, it motivates them, it largely determines their engagement and performance and whether your best people stay with you. You can't achieve your strategic goals unless you have a culture that supports it. And yet, most organisations measure engagement, and this makes sense, although it's not always done well. That's another probably series of webinars that I'd be happy to think about. But engagement survey questions are actually really bad at getting to culture. A culture survey or a diagnostic really has to be designed specifically for the purpose, with the right questions, the right scales, and based on the right models. Taking an employee engagement survey and tinkering it with it and labeling it a culture survey is not going to do it for you. But does this mean it has to be a hugely complex and expensive, typically consultancy-led initiative? No. With a little guidance and help and the right technical support, any organisation can develop the internal capabilities to manage many of the aspects themselves. So at present, the way I see it, culture is controlling the actions and decisions of people at all levels within organisations. It's time to turn it round, take control of culture, understand it, own it, manage, channel and nurture it, just like we currently do for brand. And in this webinar, we hope to be able to show you how you can begin going about this process and sharing some tips for helping to make it a success. The 5 steps you see on this slide, you'll see are arranged in a circular fashion. This indicates that this is an ongoing process. Understanding and managing your culture is an ongoing initiative which does not have any end point. You will unfortunately never reach the point where you can stop, because your engagement, your culture needs to constantly adapt to react to your changing business priorities and the changing environment in which your business operates. But it needs to be integrated into the way that you do things generally to become seen as part of the way that you do things day-to-day, business as usual. So hopefully this session will show you that you don't have to rely on expensive consultants and proprietary models to help you measure and manage your culture. You can develop the internal skills to do it yourselves. Okay. The first area I want to talk about is self-awareness. A key feature of culture, and what makes the direct assessment of it problematic, is that it exerts its effects in a hidden manner, many of which are not directly observable. In many instances, for example, senior leaders have very little experience of operating in any other organizational cultures. I've worked in many organizations and for many organizations, and in the majority of these, senior managers have often worked their entire working lives. And as culture is defined and reinforced from the top, under these conditions, it's quite difficult to develop cultural self-awareness without some help. Compounding this is that leaders have, by definition, succeeded within the current prevailing culture, and therefore it's very personally reassuring to think of it as meritocratic and healthy, even when it may not be. As a result, culture is often not well understood and may go completely unmanaged. This does not mean that the effects of culture are unknowable and uncontrollable. Quite the reverse. Organizational cultural awareness can be developed, but it doesn't arise spontaneously in many instances. It needs help. And the key questions to answer are: where are we now culturally? Where do we need to be in the future to achieve our strategic aims? So, if you like, a gap analysis, and an assessment of how what we need to do to get there. What are the behaviours that we need to encourage and discourage from all of our people, but particularly our leaders and managers, and how do we do this? I'm not usually a great lover of models, of psychological or business models, but in this context they can be extremely useful. In making the intangibles of culture tangible, the right model can be useful in providing a common language that everyone can use to describe the current and desired culture. With this in mind, one model that we found to be particularly useful in this regard is called the competing values model, a version of which we tend to use in our cultural assessments and is shown on this slide. It's an established model. It's been designed specifically within a work context. It's been tried and tested over the last 30 or 40 years, and crucially, it hasn't been dreamt up by management consultants for the purpose of selling consultancy services. It's not overly academic. It's simple without being simplistic, and hopefully has face validity. We'll test that in a minute. And most people, without any specialist knowledge, can quickly envisage where their organization sits within the schematic and where they need to be to achieve their objectives. The choice of model depends on your objectives. There are a number of ones out there, but the key questions to ask are, do they provide a common understanding and a common vocabulary that everyone can buy into? So very quickly, let me just go through what these quadrants in this model mean. In the top left-hand corner, you have a cohesive type of organization. The focus and value is on people, on shared value, open flow of information, very much based on collective decision-making and learning culture. On the downside, there can be some degree of complacency, a lack of diversity, for example, and maybe even a lack of hard-nosed business focus. Typically, organizations that fall into this quadrant tend to be partnerships, for example, or those very much driven by shared values and value of people. In the opposite quadrant, on the bottom right-hand side, we have a competitive culture which is very much outcome-driven, very much around pragmatic solutions which drive business outcomes, quite customer-focused, and if anyone's familiar with Hofstede and the cultural work he's done, very much described as a masculine, testosterone-driven kind of culture. Think maybe investment banking or hard-nosed sales environments. On the downside, often there's a focus on results rather than values, can be short-termism, can be quite hard places to work in terms of blame culture and in terms of the lack of organic flow of information, but certainly very business outcome focused. On the bottom left-hand corner, we have a control-type culture, usually larger, hierarchical, well-established organizations, strong rules and procedures, clear accountability, value process, so they're predictable and dependable. On the downside, can be inflexible, can show slow decision-making and excessive complexity, and resistance to change is often an issue. Now, as you'll notice with all of these quadrants, there are upsides and there are downsides. And with this model, the focus is on a balance between these different elements. If you find yourself too far embedded in any one of these quadrants, then the negative sides tend to come into play. So the first bit of the interactiveness nature of this webinar is now over to you. And I'd like you thinking about your organizations that you currently work in, where you see the predominant culture sitting within this schematic. And I'll pass over to Rob to explain how to do this.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, you can see the poll in front of you now. The little radio buttons to the left of each option is how you vote. So what do you think is the predominant culture in your organization? And you can start voting now, and I can see that many of you already have. Okay, so the options are cohesive, creative, competitive, or control. So I can see that roughly half of you have voted, so a few more. I can give you another 10 seconds or so, get your option in there. Okay, let's look at the results. There we are. Thank you very much for voting. There are 86 votes in that, so you can get an idea of how valid that is statistically. Back to you, Andrew. Is that roughly what you expected?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm really pleased that so many of you were able to take a view based on my very quick overview of the model. I know that some of you may already be familiar with it, but hopefully that illustrates that part of the power of this is how easily people can get their heads around what it means and how people fit into that in terms of their organizations. It is not a surprise that the majority of you feel you reside within the control quadrant. That is exactly what I would expect and what we see on a day-to-day basis. I would like to say that within organizations there is a cultural profile rather than one single culture. So obviously you would expect different parts of the business to have different predominant cultures. For example, if you were in a finance function, it would be very much around the control quadrant. If you were in R&D, for example, you might expect it to be much more creative. So this is a generalized picture of organizations, but this is what I would have expected. And hopefully it shows you that fairly quickly we can begin to make culture and elements within culture less shrouded in mystery and more describable and more tangible. If we can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Rob. So how do we assess alignment to what we are trying to achieve in terms of moving from one quadrant to another? A typical survey question within an employee engagement survey would be the one at the top. I understand what the organization strategy means for me in my day-to-day work. Now, typically an external benchmarking norm for this question would be up in the 80s. This does not mean that 80% of people know what the strategy means for them in their day-to-day work. If we objectively assess that, we find often that the actual percentage of people who really do understand is considerably lower than that. From one organization I was working with, it went from 80% to 15%. So this is not a test of understanding in any real meaningful sense. The question underneath that is a much more culturally based question, which assesses the extent to which people understand what is required of them in terms of behavioral change to achieve the organization's objectives. It was from a financial sector organization whose aim was to develop a culture driven by values rather than rules and rules-based directives. Rather than having a rigid sort of computer says no sort of approach. This was all within the background of regulation, compliance and risk management, and clearly there's a tension. And this is always what lies at the heart of culture. It is not obvious what the right answer should be. If it was, changing culture would be easy and obvious, but it clearly isn't. There's always something pulling you back, resisting the change. And in this instance, it was the tension between the need to be doing things in a freer, more personally judgment-based rather than rules-based. But obviously, pulling back in the other direction, there were regulation and compliance and risk management issues. In this case, there was a clear organizational view that there should be a movement towards the right to use personal judgments, not throwing the rule book out of the window, obviously, but to just nudge in that direction. So what we asked people to do was to say where they thought we are now, and relevant to that, where they thought they needed the organization to be to perform at the highest possible level going forward. And an aligned response would be the yellow slider to the right of the red slider. And this not only gives you a good understanding of what is required of you, but a good understanding of whether your people are aligned with what you're trying to achieve from a strategic point of view. The second thing to bear in mind is it's based on behavior. It's behaviorally anchored. So the results of this survey question don't require a huge amount of sitting down, analysing what the results mean, drawing up complex action plans. It is clear what we need to be doing. We need to be doing more of what's on the left, and the conversations would be around how do we do that while bearing in mind our responsibilities with regard to compliance and risk. The third thing to note is that this is a question that requires some thought on the part of respondent. It is not an automatic tick of a strongly agree box, for example. This does not use one of those boring 5-point scales that people are so used to seeing and getting frankly rather bored with. And this is right and proper. We want people to be giving it some thought. We want people to have discussions around what it means. And we don't want a question that is absolutely obvious what a, inverted commas, good response looks like. Moving on to the next slide, please. Okay. If you've identified where you are and where you need to be, and you've established that there is a desire to change, nothing is actually going to change without the capacity to do so. And so the second part of the thing here is the adaptability. Cultural change is achieved through change of behaviours and consequences. What gets rewarded and what gets sanctioned. And this happens at all levels, particularly within leadership and management. This requires doing things differently and can be uncomfortable for leaders, and supporting people through this process can be a key challenge. But it is in essence a developmental challenge. At the level of the individual leader, this requires quite a degree of personal self-awareness as well as organizational cultural awareness regarding their own practice, developing the capacity for adaptive leadership, understanding how what they do and how they do it impacts upon their people. And this can be particularly difficult for organizations which are high on the stability and control axis. And without which leads you to do the same things again and again and again. And as I said, breaking free from that pattern of behavior requires the ability to step outside of the culture, to observe it dispassionately and as objectively as possible. And without doing this, organizations tend to revert to type. We see it all over the place. And while it is not necessarily easy to do, it certainly can be done, and we can train people to be able to help them to do this effectively. The other benefit of this particular model of culture is that it maps quite neatly onto models of management and leadership style. So, for example, a cohesive type of culture is very much maintained and reinforced by a democratic type of leadership style, the same for laissez-faire, authoritarian and transactional, which are very well described and very well researched within the literature. The importance of this is it allows us to isolate the actual behaviours that we're looking to change and encourage to get us where we need to be in terms of changing the culture. And if we move on to the next slide, here is another example of the kind of question which is useful in a survey format to help illuminate this. A typical engagement question would be, my manager gives me regular feedback on my performance. It doesn't help us in terms of the cultural picture because it depends how this is done. An example here is, yes, my manager tells me I'm a useless waste of space on a daily basis. This is feedback on performance, but not the kind of feedback that we're looking for. Underneath is an example of a much more useful question in terms of the cultural assessment. When a mistake is made, the first instinct of management is to find out who is responsible, to use the incident as a learning, implement process or procedures, in effect another layer of complexity, and let those responsible find a solution. Each one of these is indicative of a cultural type and, allied to that, a leadership style as well. Again, none of these are necessarily good or bad. It depends what you're looking to achieve in terms of your cultural change and your organizational strategy. So now we're going to move on to the second part of the poll question. Essentially, this is allied to the first. We had the majority by far saying, okay, we feel we reside in the control quadrants. But in order to become a more optimally performing organization, particularly with regard to your strategy, where do you feel you need to be moving? Which direction do you feel you need to be moving? So I'll hand you over to Rob.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Well, I can see that most of you are voting already, so thank you for doing that. What type of culture would you like to move towards to become a high-performing organisation? The four options that you saw in the first poll are repeated here: cohesive, creative, competitive, or control. Okay, I can see that most of you have voted. So I'll just give you a little bit longer to get as many responses as possible. Okay, we don't seem to be moving much more, so let's close the poll, and we've had 79 people vote, and 57% of those are looking to move towards a cohesive culture.
This, I'm pleased to say, again, is typically what we would expect to find. There's very much often a desire to move up and to the right within the model to develop more of a cohesive and more of a creative approach. This is great for us, as you will hear from Alex now, because he will be now speaking to you a little bit about how technology can support the process of developing a more cohesive and creative culture.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. So it's my turn now to talk to you for the next couple of slides. Before we move the focus to some of the technology and tools you can use to support a desired shift in culture, I want to emphasize how crucial it is to the success of an initiative like this and the subject of inclusion. So culture is normally voiced, lived, and driven from the top, but in order for any change to stick, change has to be supported at all levels, because the culture and the behaviors that support it will need to change at all levels of an organization as well. And I think nobody would believe that it was a good idea to send an internal communication message to everyone stating that from tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, the culture of this organization will be changing, be more cohesive, because our current culture has become too controlling. So it doesn't work like that, of course. And so it really needs to involve everyone, and the culture really is very much like the sum of all the parts of an organization. And, you know, as Andrew already mentioned, there's a little bit of a danger to confuse culture with engagement, and the temptation to tag on a few culture questions to an existing survey. We're actually just preparing an article on the subject, the difference between culture and engagement, so look out for that. But you know, just doing some action planning on the back of a survey just isn't enough. And in order to better understand your current culture and how it should shift, you can also look outside your own business, like speaking to your customers. Most organizations on this call will have a customer care or customer success function, so you could speak to them to see how they perceive your organization from a customer's point of view, from the outside, because it's often hard to judge your culture purely from the inside without that outside perspective as well. And the company's perceived culture also plays a huge part in customers' buying decisions. One of the organizations we work with, Hilti, who are a manufacturer of professional power tools, which you probably won't find in your hobby shed, but more in the building trade, they have an index they call the Customer Bonding Index, and they ask customers how they see Hilti as an organization rather than just from a product perspective. And they found a strong correlation that customers with a high bonding index have a higher average spend with Hilti. So it's a good idea to do that, but also you could talk to your suppliers, because that's another source of an outside voice that can give you some insight into your culture. So these are just some ideas of how you could supplement and any internal findings on your culture with some outside views. A really important part of any culture initiative are, of course, your line managers. And as Andrew already mentioned, this is where a lot of the activities will succeed or fail. And you may have heard of the term permafrost layer of management. That kind of describes the middle to lower management layer where executive messages usually grind to a halt and find it hard to penetrate and really have an impact throughout the organization. And it's not really a surprise when you think about how busy line managers normally are. They deal with day-to-day operational issues, managing personnel, writing reports, monitoring performance against their KPI. So it's not hard to imagine that if they receive a message to initiate a culture change in their team, they may find it hard to deal with that. And they're usually not even well equipped to know how to do this and deal with this. So what we've seen working well in these circumstances is a kind of a closed community or a walled garden purely for managers where they can meet with peers, ask questions of each other, ask for advice, but in a closed, non-public environment. So the key to this is to encourage the sharing of best practice. What has worked so far? Let's share this with all managers so they can adopt a similar approach. Or if you have devised certain approaches or activities, share them here, but also get feedback on how easy they were to implement and how they were perceived by staff. This way, you can over time evolve your materials and your messages through feedback from your line managers so it becomes more and more engaging and effective. So the other aspect I'd like to mention is enablement. There's a dictionary definition of what that means on the slide, and what I'm talking about here is the second part. So now I don't want to drift into a blatant sales pitch, of course, but this is exactly what Questback does, but I keep this very generic. And there are three considerations I will keep on top of my mind when looking at the tools and technology that can support you with a culture change. The first one is simplicity and making it easy for people to use. Usually, their lives are complicated enough. They need something they can embrace easily that doesn't distract them from what they want to achieve with the tools. And secondly is automation, to help keeping the administrative and resource burden low so they can really focus on the content. And third is insight and how you drive performance and drive the right actions from the data. Now it seems a mundane point, but it's incredibly important and often very challenging to do, especially for large organizations. But this is how you map your organization's structure and hierarchies, so you can then segment the data and the different cultural findings across your organization accordingly, similar to how you would deal with that in engagement surveys. So in large organizations, that can be incredibly complex, with data needing to be reported at regional, local, team levels, as well as functional views and matrix views. So if you find groups of people coming back with different answers, how else do you go back and do more in-depth analysis and ask them follow-up questions? So having technologies that allows you to do that easily and in real time is incredibly valuable in this case. Also, to my point of simplicity, making it easy for people, it helps to provide people with a kind of digital home where they can go and know that they can provide feedback on all kinds of issues, some structured but also unstructured as free text comments. This should be configurable so it can be an always-on approach, or it could be part of a requested feedback on specific issues or topics. Mobile apps are obviously very useful for this, or dynamic portals which you can adjust and then adjust themselves usually to connecting screen sizes. So these should support dialogue, and that's one of the key words here. This isn't about just another survey. It's more to initiate the dialogue and conversation about the topics, to involve people in the shifts that are being solved. So often these platforms should be accessible through existing platforms via single sign-in or separate registrations, but they need to be positioned as feedback channels so they're clearly differentiated from a more passive or corporate-controlled intranet environment. And finally, there's of course the part where your insights turn into action. And this usually starts with visualization of the data you get and building in the decision support that you need. So important here is to be able to see how the data varies throughout the organization, and the dashboards should be designed fairly self-explanatory without the need to bring in data analysts or insight teams, but that you can give managers access to them so they see what's going on in their team. And don't forget, this is a continuous cycle, so this data could be changing in real time as people participate in these always-on feedback initiatives. So vital signs and early warnings are typically what you look out for in these dashboards. And they can give you some real-time insights into what is happening in your organization and whether the change is working effectively or where progress is slowing. So one example of this is some work we've done with an investment bank who were churning a lot of their new recruits. In fact, it was almost 50% in the first 12 months of employment. And as you can imagine, that's a very high churn, costing the organization a lot of money. So now when they did some exit interviews, it was clear that culture was actually stated as one of the reasons why they didn't want to stay in the organization. And people didn't feel they were fitting in. So when they investigated this further, they found that hiring managers and recruitment teams were hiring according to more stated and published values and messages, which emphasized a strong team culture. And were looking for cohesive team players. But what was actually rewarded and lauded in the teams, in practice, were very much individual achievements and star performers rather than the team efforts. And that, of course, put many people off. So it's a good example of where organizations lack this self-awareness of their own predominant culture. So another tip would be to use feedback through your onboarding programs to evaluate how new candidates see your culture through fresh eyes and how aligned this is with the expectations that had been attracted to your organizations in the first place. And, you know, another element can also have a big impact on your culture, and that is the performance management and target setting. So it's important to strike the right balance here between, you know, the business outcomes, the voice of the customer, and also the voice of the employee and the health of the team. And with that, I hand back to Andrew, who's going to talk to you about the triangle graph that we have next. Just go over that.
Thanks, Alex. The final of the 5 steps is around performance. If we're looking to develop a high-performance culture, we need to make explicit links between the cultural types and the outcomes. For 15 years or now, I've been helping organizations explore the links between employee engagement and performance outcomes. And it's a very similar process for culture, but could in itself be the subject of a whole webinar in itself, so I'll be as brief as possible. It's an essential step, as you can't really use the phrase high performance culture without actually understanding how the culture impacts upon your performance outcomes. And it's a very powerful thing to do yourselves with your own outcome measures and your own performance KPIs. Some behaviours will be common, some will be that drive the right cultural profile, others will be specific to your organisations. One thing I do know is that when you look at performance, it's best seen in a holistic way. So it involves engagement, if you see that as an outcome of your culture, customer satisfaction, financial KPIs. We tend to view high performance across the piece in a holistic way with all of these things performing well. But a combination or any single ones of these will help in the analysis and definition of what a high performance culture is. So in summary, I'm just going to summarize here and from an assessment point of view, because I'm an assessment psychologist, just highlight some of the things that make a cultural assessment different and distinct from an employee engagement survey. First of all, the importance is on leadership behaviours. Behaviours define and reinforce your culture, drive or hinder performance. If your managers, leaders, and people generally are doing the right things, your business is more likely to succeed. Attitudes and beliefs, perceptions are the traditional focus for engagement surveys, but the fact is that in practical terms, behaviours are what really make the difference because they're observable and measurable, and there's something that you can directly influence and control. A focus on behaviours also means that it's clear what needs to be done. You don't have to sit around wondering what survey results mean and draw up complex action plans. The actions are clear because they're defined by the approach that you're taking and the questions that you ask. And the focus is on management, leadership development, and how that impacts upon the way leaders and managers react in specific situations and develop a repertoire of styles to deal with different issues. The starting point for the design is your organizational imperatives, your strategy, your values, and a model is there to help you structure this. not dictate what the contents of your structure should be. What dictates the content should be your organizational strategy, what you need to do, and how you need to get there. Many models of employee engagement do this, but your starting point should be your individual needs. Another thing to bear in mind is that high scores are not necessarily good. I often question organizations' constant quest for high levels of satisfaction or high levels of engagement. If everyone is happy with everything, what's going to change? Why are they going to be motivated to suggest improvements? Change requires a degree of dissatisfaction with the status quo. It requires a vision of what could be better in the future and the way things could be. If you're constantly looking for reassurance that everything is great, people will tell you that it is great. And before long, you'll find out that it really isn't. Also, there's a danger of focusing on percentages, numerical targets, external benchmarks that can lead to chasing numbers rather than actually making substantive changes that are really required. So, if you've been doing surveys for a while, and you've reached a plateau in your scores, they're all high, they don't change from year to year, there's not much of a pattern across the organization, you can't really shift the dial in anymore, maybe your approach needs to change. Maybe your employee engagement survey is losing a bit of traction. Where can you go? Well, the way forward may be an increased focus on culture to either supplement your existing survey. And hopefully, this session has given you a few tips to how you might start going about that process. So that's me finished. I'll hand you now back over to Rob.
Thank you, Andrew. Very, very interesting. I have enjoyed that talk, both of you. And it is interesting to see how different, looking at this in terms of culture, how different that is compared to when we look at it in terms of employee engagement. We've got time for a few questions now, and I can see that some of you have sent some in already. Okay, so let's have a look at Annabelle's question. Annabelle asks, she says, in a very decentralized organization with UK-wide business units having autonomy to lead their site, how would you recommend enhancing the culture to move from intangible to tangible?
I think this is a very good case in point. What you find within decentralized organizations is that they can become the fiefdoms of the local management. And the impact on the culture can be very, very well defined and very measurable. So to bring that out into the open, to deploy a single assessment across an organization and look for differences between the individual parts of a devolved organization can be extremely instructive. And then the types of conversations that you need to be having with the leadership within those individual units is, what is the impact of what you're doing? What underpins these differences within the cultures that we see? And that is the starting point for developing those kinds of conversations. So actually in that kind of organization, this kind of approach can be an extremely useful and illuminating thing to be doing.
Okay, thank you. Got an interesting question from Graham, who turned this into a recruitment issue. So how much should you recruit according to cultural fit of the organisation?
Well, this is a question that we actually were talking about before we came onto this session. And I think the answer is a qualified yes. I think it can be a good thing to do to recruit on the basis of cultural fit, for example. But you have to be absolutely crystal clear about what that means in terms of what you're looking for and what you're not looking for. Unless you can clearly define what that is, it can turn into an assessment of whether your face fits or not. And I think that's the potential problem with this kind of approach. I've spoken to a lot of people who have felt very aggrieved because they haven't been selected for positions because the feedback was that it wasn't felt to be a good cultural fit. And unless organizations can really articulate what that means, then it's probably best not to. As a general rule, if you have any doubt, do it on the basis of values rather than culture, because they are often much better expressed.
Okay. Two similar questions from Bob and from Liz. To what extent is cultural representation of the personality of the person at the top of the organisation? What if the behaviour of directors is not compatible with the culture they want? How can this be tackled?
The culture, yes, if you do have a very charismatic, sort of messianic type culture, absolutely the personality of the person at the top can dictate. That can be in a positive or a negative way. If you do move towards a more cohesive culture, I think those effects tend to get diluted a bit, because you have much more of a common view of how the culture is set by everybody. But actually, I think if you do have a culture that is largely dictated by a charismatic or very dynamic or forceful leader, that can be either a good or a bad thing, depending. And the second part of the question was?
No, I think you've answered both parts really. It's really about that relationship between whoever's leading the organisation, the directors or the person at the top.
Yes, but ideally it probably shouldn't be if we're looking to move to a cohesive model.
Yeah. Okay, all right. And I think we've got just time for one more question, and that's from Lucy. Are we saying that rather than measuring engagement, organisations should be measuring culture? Do we do both, or one or the other?
We can do both. We can do one or the other. I would be an advocate of doing both, particularly if you're looking for how your culture either engenders or damages employee engagement. You can do both at the same time, but as I said before, you need to make sure that your questions that you're using are fit for purpose. So I think that's a qualified yes again.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Alex. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. As you log out, please fill in the exit survey to provide us with some feedback. Today's webinar, as I said, will be available on demand in the next day or so. Visit personaltoday.com/webinars or look out in your email the things that we'll be sending you, which will include a transcript and the PowerPoint slides, and we'll also be circulating a white paper on this topic. Personnel Today's next webinar is on the 22nd of June, and it's looking at how to get started in data analytics. Look out for details of that next week on Personnel Today. Okay, it just leaves me to thank both our guests, Andrew Cox and Alex Vilka. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've been listening to a Personnel Today webinar in association with Questback. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye.